talk don't bother me.
And welcome to Let Them Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo. Another great show in store for you, and we'll get right down to it. We're going to talk about housing. So if you live in a rent-stabilized apartment or any sort of apartment or building or domicile of any kind in Manhattan or any of the 5 boroughs over the internet and probably around the world, you could learn something. My guests would be the ones to ask. In fact, maybe we could take some of your calls. I don't know if somebody wants to call in. Maybe we'll throw the number up there later. All right, I'm Paul DiRienzo, and my guest, Sheila Garcia, from the Community Force or Task Force?
Community Action for Safe Apartments.
Oh, okay, I couldn't read my own handwriting. I'm sorry. Community Action for Safe Apartments, and Sadia Rahman from the Urban Justice Center. I guess that makes you a housing attorney.
It does.
Wow. All right. Usually it's $300 an hour. Not you, though.
For free tonight.
For free tonight. Thank you so much. All right. Great for joining us. And, well, we're talking about a lot of things. I have to say, I thought it was a done deal when I heard that 2-year lease is only going up 2% from the. And now I'm hearing that might change, that there's a challenge to that from the landlords. They might overturn the 0% increase.
Yeah, so the Rent Stabilization Association, which is a group of they claim 25,000 landlords throughout the city, has challenged the decision made by the Rent Guidelines Board in June. They're saying that the 0% it's illegal, which means that the whole decision made by the board would be called into question. And so they actually sued the city in Supreme Court, asking for the decision for a judge to ask the board to vote again, or for the judge to make a different decision of some sort.
There's a couple of things I have to say to that. Number one is, I didn't hear any court rule that $85 increase a few years back for people who paid less than $1,000 a month was wrong. Nobody turned that back, and it seemed pretty unfair since it wasn't even announced or discussed or talked about. And number two, what are the chances of this thing being approved? This suit winning or achieving its goal of rolling up the rents.
So this morning, tenants actually had a group of tenants had a press conference because they're entering into the case, intervening in the case. I think that's the legal term, where they're asking the court to uphold the 0% increase because actually tenants needed a rent reduction,
of course,
and that tenants throughout the city are struggling, and that the board has actually increased rents for 46 years before the 0% last year and the 0% this year, so that they should just continue to do and let the board function the way it should. And so I think that we're hoping the judge will say, oh, this is just not right, and throw it all out. But I don't think that that's what's going to happen. It seems like the judge is entertaining the idea and is willing to hear both sides right now. Really?
Does that have to do with the presidential election and that one of the largest real estate moguls in the city is the son-in-law of one of the guy who's running for president, who's also one of the largest real estate moguls in New York?
I have no idea, but I think you brought up a good point about the $85 sort of the poor tax that was called
the poor
years
tax
back on the rent increases, and I think the hypocriticalness is there, right? Like when the RGB did that 8.5%, the RSA wasn't complaining, right? The RGB at that point had done something that it had never done before. And now they're saying the 0% thing is something that the RGB has also never done before, but this time it's not allowed. So if they had the power to do something like that, 4 years ago, they should also have the power to do the same thing this year.
If the judge were to egads, support the landlords in this fight, what would that do? Throw the thing back to the Rent Guidelines Board, or would it? And Sheila, you are a member. You're a tenant representative on the Rent Guidelines Board, so you were there for these discussions.
Right.
And
so I've been on the Rent Guidelines Board for 3 years.
So you've seen a lot happen, right?
And before that, I have been doing tenant organizing in the Bronx, and I've heard and I knew that the Rent Guidelines Board existed, and it was never a board that was open to listening to tenants' testimonies before.
What is the Rent Guidelines Board? I think I'm realizing a lot of folks might not even know what it is.
Sure. So the Rent Guidelines Board is a board for New York City that decides how much rent increase, rent adjustments, is the way the law is written, rent adjustments, this rent stabilized apartments have. And so that what that means is that every year a 9-person board meets to decide if there are going to be any adjustments to rents for rent stabilized apartments. And there's about 1 million apartments throughout the city. And that means that you have 6 or more units, you pay less than $2,700 in rent, and your building was built before 1974. And so if your building fits that mold, the likelihood of you being rent stabilized, if you live in the outer boroughs more than Manhattan, is really high. Like, for example, in the Bronx, where I work, 74% of all kind of housing in that area is actually rent stabilized. And so that means you have more protections than other folks throughout the city have around the right to live in your apartment and the right to have renewal leases every year, regardless of whether the landlord likes you or not, or the landlord has to provide you with a lease within 90 days before your lease expires. And so that gives you protections that, if you live in a private house, you wouldn't have. And so that's like really exciting, and that's why it's really powerful to protect this kind of housing. And so the board comes together to not protect it necessarily, but to make decisions that affect it. There's 2 tenant representatives, 2 landlord representatives, and 5 people that represent the public. And they vote. And so anything passes as long
Who
as it
appoints them? How do they get on
the
there?
mayor.
All of them?
Yes.
And you were appointed by?
Mayor de Blasio.
Mayor de Blasio, okay. And you live in the Bronx?
Yes.
Where 70+% of the housing is stabilized?
Well, right in the area where I work in NYC.
Right. And where's that? Which area?
It's in the Southwest Bronx. So, Yankee Stadium all the way to about the Cross Bronx where it starts.
Right. I see. And so this is now scary to me because I think and I'm spending more time on this than I thought I would, because I believe I've heard that there was an attempt by landlords in New York to go to the Supreme Court and claim that rent stabilization was an illegal taking under the Fifth Amendment, and that this is unfair seizure of property that belongs to other people, and that this was denied. But friends have said, well, one stroke of a Supreme Court justice could change rent stabilization in a minute, right? In a heartbeat, potentially.
Well, it would. So this decision around this argument around the 0% is different than how it would affect rent stabilization as a whole. But it does actually mean that future boards would be less likely to vote for something like a 0 or a rent rollback, right? So if we, are told to vote again to remake our decision, that actually does affect who sits on the board and how they think about what that means. They would actually think, oh, well, the court decided that it was illegal or something we couldn't do. And they're actually claiming that a 0% is a taking. And that is unconstitutional. And so it's an interesting argument because they, for 46 years, had been getting increases after increases, even when their costs of doing business actually went down, even when the economy was really bad, they still saw, increases like no other kind of market, no other business in the world. During 2008, rent still increased. 2009, 2010, things actually were getting really bad for tenants, and they were still seeing profits and making profits. So I think that we do have a really good argument, and we have tenants throughout the city who are, representing, the population of rent stabilized tenants, saying this is actually not only right, but they should have done more.
And New York City tenants are well known as, willing to take to the streets to protest and civil disobedience and do all those kind of things. So, and we've seen that before, right? In New York City history, fighting evictions going back to the 1930s, and for all I know, before that even. All right, so, wow. So I'm shocked already. So you heard this on Let Them Talk. You might not, I read it nowhere else. The New York Times is pretty much pro-landlord as far as I'm concerned, and you've seen this nowhere else. You sure as heck couldn't turn to the New York Observer, owned by Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of Donald Trump. I can't help but bring that up. I always thought the reason he's running is, to undo rent stabilization in New York. That's the real reason he's running for president. I always thought he is that venal. Yes, I could see it. So, okay, what other problems? Now we were talking MCIs, right? Major Capital Improvements. Okay, say even you know, shockingly upon shockingly, they raise everybody's rent and all the legal problems that would go into the people who already had 0%. What are they going to sue them for the money they should have gotten if it was an illegal taking? What are they going to do for the people up to 2-year leases who got a 1 or 2% increase? So, you know, to me, it's mind-boggling to open this can of worms by making this kind of decision, going back on a decision of the Rent Guidelines Board. Well, we'll see. That's the future. Now, once you are in an apartment, you are paying whatever rent you're paying. There's other ways to increase the rent, right? Mm-hmm. And one of them is this major capital improvement, which can be terribly unfair and is basically a giant loophole you could drive a semi-truck right through in the middle of rent stabilization, and allows landlords to get around it and raise rents and still stay allegedly legal. So tell us a little bit about MCIs and how they work in New York City.
Sure. So in rent-stabilized buildings, or even mixed buildings, right, where there's some rent-stabilized units and some market-rate units, landlords can apply, or landlords can do major capital work to a building. So they can replace a roof or a boiler or install a security system. And then within 2 years after completing that work, they can make an application to DHCR, which is the state agency in charge of supervising rent stabilization in New York City.
Department of Housing Community Renewal, right. DHCR.
Yep. They can make an application asking to offset those costs or pass on the entire cost to the tenants. And so they take that dollar amount, with $100,000, $1 million, whatever they claim to have spent on improving the building, and pass that cost on to tenants by increasing their rent, proportionate to how many apartments, to how many rooms they have in their apartment. And it's a permanent increase, so that even after they've paid themselves back, that increase sticks with the person's rent for the duration of their tenancy.
Right, so that's what I can't understand. So let's say the landlord buys you a $500 refrigerator, which I thought landlords were supposed to, you know, supply all throughout history. They supply them, right? And now he decides to charge you $800 for your new Amana fridge or Frigidaire or whatever it is, and then you pay an increased rent in perpetuity that could add up to thousands and thousands of dollars. I mean, a gold-plated refrigerator.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you are asking to have an appliance fixed or whatever, for that at least the landlord needs your written consent. Not fixed, I'm sorry, replaced. If you're asking for something new and it gets replaced, you have to sign written consent. With an MCI, there's no consent process.
Oh, really?
And there's no...
What kind of things are covered by MCI then?
So, things that have to be building-wide. And the law says that it's supposed to inure to the benefit of all of the tenants. So, if it is something that's done, supposed to be, if it's something that's done piecemeal or only affects half of the tenants or only affects the 6th floor but not floors 1, 2, and 3, and 4, those things are not supposed to be eligible for an MCI. Now, we've recently seen decisions where that's not always true, and work has been done in piecemeal fashion, but the MCIs are still approved, which is problematic. But it's usually major. That's why major is in the word major capital improvement. It has to be major work to the building. The other thing that's really unfair about it is that you never get notice that the landlord intends on applying for a major capital improvement. So he can do the work, invest the money, you don't know what's going to happen, and then 2 years later you get sacked with this increase.
I see. And once it's approved by DHCR, is the DHCR sort of like the Maytag repairman of state agencies? Whatever they want, they approve?
You know, sometimes they come out with good decisions and sometimes they come out with bad decisions. And that's, I think, the biggest problem at DHCR is there is often no sort of rhyme or reason or uniformity across the agency as to why they decided the way they decided. In housing court, at least you have judges who have a system of making sure that they don't have conflicting opinions, right? That they're not writing conflicting decisions. And that's the way sort of our American court system works. In DHCR, you can literally have 2 rent administrators sitting, I imagine, in very dull cubicles sitting next to each other and come to the exact opposite conclusion, and that's okay.
I see. So you get the impression that the DHCR administrators are detached from what's going on and from the people. Are they located in New York City? Are they in Albany? Where do they operate?
So everything is resolved in Queens.
In Queens.
Plaza in Jamaica, yeah.
All right, that's where it's all done. So is there any investigation? Do they go in? They don't take any sort of commentary from the? This is what I'm getting at. Let's say there's a leak in the roof. Is repairing the roof a major capital investment if the roof is already leaking?
No, so that's a defense that you can raise, right? If the landlord did work and the work is still, as a result of the work, it started leaking or the roof is leaking all the time, that's a defense. The landlord should not be entitled to the increase. But if the entire roof was replaced, then nonetheless, the landlord might still get an increase.
I see. So if there's a leak in one corner of the roof and they replace the entire roof and not just fix the leak, then that's a major capital. I see.
Yeah.
And all of the different areas in the building that they can actually repair have a life expectancy. Like windows, I don't actually remember what all of the numbers are, but like if you replace the windows in 2011, you can't just replace them in 2013. You have to they have a life, a useful life.
Yes.
So some landlords have done and used this tactics of, especially predatory equity buildings, where they come in, they buy the buildings for a lot of money, and they need to, in order to pay off that mortgage, a really high mortgage, they need to be able to collect rent. And one way they do it, if the Rent Guidelines Board percentages are not enough, is they actually start doing MCI. So we've seen in buildings in the Bronx, for example, where landlords are coming in and replacing all of the windows, regardless of whether they were replaced recently. They're redoing all of the kitchens, although the kitchens were working perfectly fine, and they are, doing bathrooms. And then now, as a result, tenants have more issues that they had when they first started the work, and some of the work wasn't actually needed. And so they do have defenses. They can organize, form a tenant association, answer, try to seek legal advice from attorneys, and figure out, what is happening. But that is a long process. It's it's a really technical process, and it's really important for people to get involved and find help from a tenant organization that's organizing, or seek help from other tenants that have done this in the past, in order to really orient themselves and build power. Because the ACR does, if you get an MCI and it gets approved and they're saying, oh, this is what it's going to be, you have time to be able to respond and say whether the work was done or not done. If the building isn't organized and is really all over the place, and no one feels, or someone says, oh, you're going to do it, then, it might fall by the wayside, and you might have a really high increase on top of all of the Rent Guidelines Board increases. And the cost of living, and we all know the city's really expensive. You're actually, losing a battle, and, landlords are winning. And we want tenants to be able to stay. We want tenants to be able to have affordable housing.
Right. Sheila Garcia, Community Action for Safe Apartments and a tenant representative on the Rent Guidelines Board. Sadia Rahman from the Urban Justice Center. Are there any phone numbers that people need, or any places they can go to get more information, web pages and things like that?
We run a tenant hotline, so if folks have questions, it's a hotline that a lot of legal services providers across the city sort of staff, so that's 646-459-3036.
So we have 646-459-3036. That is the hotline, the tenant hotline, so people can get more information if they are running into these kind of problems. All right, 646-459-3036. Well, so MCI seem like a serious problem, but basically the defense is that if the building is not up to code, then you have to bring it up to code before you can make an improvement, wouldn't you think?
It's not a defense that lasts. So if you raise it as a defense, normally what DHCR will order, go ahead and fix those other things, those C violations, those really egregious violations, and then once you fix it, the MCI will kick in. The sort of defenses that are lasting is that normally the building wasn't trying to think of some of the stuff that I've seen win, but lately a lot of things are not winning. A lot of MCIs are just going through. So some of the stuff that does win is if you could prove that the work wasn't done to the benefit of everybody, or if there was sort of some inside handshake agreement between the landlord and somebody who actually works for the landlord, and so it wasn't an arm's length transaction. It was just two guys doing each other favors and then sort of passing on costs to raise the rent. So there are defenses available, but they're not things that come like naturally to tenants, and that's why I can't stress Sheila's point enough that it's really important when tenants get the notice to talk to their neighbors and start organizing, because what your instinct is to say, well, I didn't ask for this major capital improvement, or I have things in my apartment that need to be fixed, why should I pay an increase? And those are the things that are not defenses to an MCI. And so it's really, really, really important to organize and talk to your neighbors and sort of get collective knowledge together and sort of figure out how to move through the system that way. And DHCR just pays more attention to tenants when it's 35 folks signing on to an opposition for an MCI than just 5 random people in a building.
I see. Like the whole building would have to get together around it.
Yeah, not whole, but a good critical mass makes DHCR stand up and pay attention more.
I see. Or else they just tend to take the position of the landlord, it seems. Right. That's New York for you. What's the mayor doing about this? Putting you on the board, right?
That's the idea.
Right.
But this is a state problem, right? So DHCR is a state agency. This is a rent stabilization code. So this MCI problem is an Albany problem, and nothing can get resolved like good and substantively until sort of the tide changes in Albany.
I see. So what needs to be done is to change the law regarding MCIs. They're using MCIs for purposes that were not originally intended, it seems. Instead of fixing up a building for the benefit of everybody, they're just using it to jack up rents. A backdoor way of doing it. That's your position.
Yeah, and there's also just better ways that they can administer the program, right? Like it might be better if tenants had noticed that the landlord intends on doing this work, so that you can closely monitor the landlord as they are doing the work, as opposed to finding out after the fact. Because right after the fact, then you as a tenant have to hire your engineer or an architect or contractor to go back and assess this work. That's cost prohibitive for a lot of tenants, and just really hard to go back and piece together pieces of this puzzle 2 years later. Whereas if you can watch it as it's happening, that might be good. The other thing is MCI notices are only in English, and it's kind
They're
of
only in English.
Unintelligible when you get it for a lawyer. So like,
sounds like Donald Trump again.
Regular folks are getting these letters in the mail that don't make a lot of sense to them, and you have only 30 days to oppose it, is completely unfair to a majority of New York City residents. So there are things that can be approved that can either be done on the administrative level at DHCR, but really in order to get things to be actually fair, something needs to happen in Albany.
Right, and that's as long as there's logjam in the legislature there. How's the governor stand on this, Governor Cuomo?
You know, he's hard to read.
He's hard to read, right?
I guess that's what everybody says about him, right?
Right. He's hard to read, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's for me and for all rent stabilized tenants who came and testified in front of the Rent Guidelines Board, these issues are around affordability and being able to stay in their homes. And so if we want a city that's diverse, and we want a city that, you know, we can go and get Mexican food, Indian food, and all of these different cultures all come together for the city to be this melting pot that everybody loves so much. We need to be able to afford to live here. And so, you know, when the Bronx is the most affordable borough in the city, and people who live in the Bronx pay about 50% of their income in rent, there is a problem. And I think that, you know, the fight for Albany and organizing and joining a tenant group to make sure that you join those buses that go up to Albany is important. That is why it's important to come and fight around the Rent Guidelines Board in order to make sure that we have decisions that are made with your voices. If not, you know, who are they going to listen to? The big business and people who have a lot more power and money.
Right.
And so we have people power, so we need to use that.
Is that ultimately what's happening here with this attack? I mean, it's basically immigrant people in New York City who are being affected, people who are already working often 10 and 12-hour jobs, 6 to 7 days a week, trying to live here and support a family and make a life in a new country, are the ones being hit by ever-increasing rents. Almost like forced, like a carrot. Like when you can't, no matter how hard you work, you have to work more hours and more hours just to get by. And that's sort of taking advantage of people, I would say. I mean, in my opinion, it seems like you're taking advantage of people by doing that.
Definitely. And I think that, like, the combating piece is, like, the organizing work. and coming together and deciding what kind of changes do you want to make, and making sure that you're like being thoughtful and organized, and pushing to make sure you get these issues, you get your issues resolved. And that happens in a building, organizing around an MCI or organizing around conditions, to like bigger community issues that we see and that we're seeing around the rezonings, for example. And so that power is actually really influential, and they listen when we're all together.
About the rezoning, what do you? I know we've had shows. I've actually had folks from the rezoning that really impacted Lower East Side, where I'm from, and we've had folks here talking who were on the committee that was looking into rezoning for years down there and changed the zoning on the Lower East Side. What do you think? I mean, I've been told, and my understanding is now the housing is going to be more, it's going to be denser, and there's been some complaints that the income levels for the housing that's supposed to be provided for working class people and lower income people are way too high.
Right. And so normally that's like, what you said is exactly right. So they just announcing a rezoning, we see a spike in tenants feeling pressure both in rent and also around conditions. Maybe conditions get worse. Maybe you see harassment with construction as harassment. Maybe you see a whole bunch of different issues in just the announcement of like, we're thinking about rezoning something, because they know property value is going to increase. They know that they're trying to bring in people with more money who could pay higher rent. And normally those people don't look like the people who are currently living there. Don't do the jobs that those folks do. And so that is a really big deal. And I think that when I mentioned the rezoning, when it comes to, the Rent Guidelines Board, and when it comes to the fight, is that, if we continue to have loopholes like the MCIs, and we continue to have rent increases from the Rent Guidelines Board, and DHCR continues to make decisions like that are benefiting landlords and increasing rents, we're going to see displacement. And we're continue to see displacement. And we see, in Chinatown, where like organizations are organizing, they see 1 or 2 residents who have been there for 15 years.
Now, what do we last 40 seconds? Sheila, Garcia, Sadia, Rahman, thank you so much for coming and joining us, talking about tenant issues. We have half a minute, and I just wanted, what about the homeless, the poorest, the people on the very bottom of society? How are we going to get them into homes?
That's a whole other show.
I know. I have to say that though, right? Because I mean, these buildings are being built, but we're not seeing the poorest of the poor. We're seeing the homeless numbers just increase across the city, and that is a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think we work really hard to make sure that families don't become homeless. That's our jobs, right? Is to keep them in their homes, and I think more affordable apartments and things that people can actually afford need to happen, and they're not.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead. We'll add this on tape.
I think that it's really important to also organize in order to continue to make sure that they're listening and your voices are heard. Because if you're homeless or you have been formerly homeless, you know what that struggle is like, and you can't just stand by and continue to see the process or the cycle continue. So if you have the opportunity and are able to join and organize, that's like a great way of making sure that other people don't go through what you go through, or that doesn't happen to you again.
Great. Thank you very much.